Welcome back to the AHF. Today I'm going to be talking about the dagger, which is known as the Swordbreaker. This is the kind of weapon which has captured people's imaginations an awful lot, and you will see it in museum collections, a lot of books, sort of coffee table books on the subject, as well as more detailed books. And the term Swordbreaker is, as far as we can tell, quite a modern one, but it is characterised by these teeth in the blade section, which were designed for either catching, trapping, or breaking an opponent's blade. So that's just a sort of a brief introduction as to what sort of weapon it is. Now, in every other way, it resembles a typical offhand dagger that you would use with something like a rapier, the sort of dagger that we call a main gauche, which is characterised normally by a side ring, and its classic Renaissance style to be used with rapiers, side swords, and other similar weapons. The blade length here is about average and typical. So the sort of weapon we'd be looking to use with this would probably be the rapier. All of the examples I've come across of these sword breakers were dated to around the late 16th century or the early 17th century. Now, the most common sort of weapon in use in sort of civilian time at that point was the rapier. Now, rapier can mean different things at different time periods and to different people, but largely at that sort of time period, we're talking about the very, very long-bladed rapiers, which are typically around about 42 or even up to sort of 45 and more inch blade length. So very, very long rapiers, which focus a lot on the point. They still have some cutting work to be used, but they're really heavily point-orientated. Other swords certainly existed at the time, of course, so there were still things like side swords and back swords and various kinds of sabres and even some two-handed and longsword type weapons as well. But the rapier of that type was the most common of its time, and therefore this sort of swordbreaker is associated with that sort of combat. And I think that's quite an accurate assessment. From our practice, you will find that this sort of dagger is really well suited to point-based sort of fencing, and not so good for cutting actions. In terms of blade orientation, and by that I mean where is the actual sharp edge and where is the teeth sort of edge. Well, this is the way I've normally seen them constructed, although I believe I have seen one or two examples with them the other way around. I think this is by far the most typical setup, and I think that's not so surprising because when you consider most people are right-handed, if you hold this dagger in the right hand, the cutting edge is naturally forward, so a true edge, which is ideal and generally useful, and if you put it into your left hand, the teeth edge is forward for engaging people's rapiers when you've got something, a sword in your main hand. So that's about blade orientation. Now, in terms of using these sort of teeth sections, are they there to catch or to trap or to break? Now also, if you look at surviving examples, the size of these teeth, both the depth and the width, can vary quite a lot on different examples, and I'll show those in the video as well. As well as these sections here, which we would consider to be barbs, like a barbed arrow, which are designed to stop things coming back out once they've gone into the teeth section. So this is quite sort of modest on the barbs, but it still has them. Now, was it designed to trap a blade, or was it designed to break a blade? Now, as you can see, as a blade enters here, it could exist just for that purpose, that a blade engages and it stops it disengaging easily up and down. So that momentary sort of trap, it's not going to last long and it could be withdrawn, but just enough to give that opening to strike our opponent. And that could be enough in itself, because trying to disengage your blade from that, you have to actually go back out this way. And most people, they start to panic once their blade becomes trapped, and it's going to be trapped from going up and down. The next thing is using a twist and the barbs, is the blade can become completely locked, as you'll see in some videos, and then it is almost impossible to get the blade back out. So whether it exists to just actually catch like this, trap, or potentially break, and I'm not going to try and break this because this is several £100 of training rapier, I would say it's not that likely that you're going to break a blade. A lot of these rapier blades were really well constructed, and they're a little bit flexible as well. Plenty of originals were as well. So I don't think it's that likely that you're going to break one of these blades. There is, of course, an increased risk of breaking, but I don't think it's really the intention of the dagger. I think the term Swordbreaker is very much a romanticised term to make it sound impressive, and it's the kind of term that might have actually been used historically to sell it, because of course if you're a trader trying to sell these weapons to your vendors, the term Swordbreaker, it sounds intimidating, it sounds impressive, it sounds like the kind of edge that you might want to get in a fight. So yeah, the term may well have been used, but I think something like sword catcher might actually be more representative for this. But as far as language change goes, it's universally been accepted through pretty much almost every museum and every collector and every book I've read that they now call this a sword breaker. So whether it's the intended term or intended meaning, that is now what they now call the sword breaker. So why might you put these teeth on there? Well, so far I've shown you some of the engagements with the rapier blade where it can actually snag, trap or potentially break. What else might you put it on there? Well, I would say first of all as a sales gimmick. As I've just said, I think it's potentially a very good sales gimmick, but also for intimidation factor. When you can intimidate your opponent in a fight, that can be absolutely fight winning in terms of fight psychology. So yes, if you can make your opponent hesitate, if you can make them sort of shake in fear, if in any way you can affect their fight and cause them to slow down or be wary or not take certain sort of actions or risks that they might otherwise do, that can be an advantage. So this could have been an intimidation weapon, much like some of the, for example, the huge lantern shields that we see with, you know, big sort of armoured gauntlets and blades sticking out of them. I think intimidation is a massive factor, whether it's particularly a practical sort of device or not. So just a little bit about how we would actually use this in the fight. Well, as I said, it is a normal rapier dagger, so you can use all of your normal technique. But in terms of the way parries work, we would typically use a rapier dagger with the thumb sort of on the back of the blade, on the flat like this. And you can often use these almost sort of windscreen wiper type motions. Now, when you start breaking parries down to doing this, 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 and this, you can start to see where engagements would work and where they wouldn't. Is that if you parry straight up like this, you're going to catch the opponent's blade on the actual sharp edge, so you'd actually have to rotate around to use the teeth in that particular parry, which then exposes the thumb and doesn't really get to use the side ring. However, on all your other parries, it works really well. So you cross parry in front of your face over the top of your sword arm, you cross parry or reverse parry underneath your sword arm, the teeth are in play, or you parry with a descending parry and again the teeth come on to the opponent's blade. So 3 out of your 4 parries work well, and that 4th sort of parry can be made to work as well. On to how it worked with cutting actions, because of course the rapiers can still cut. You'll still see plenty of cutting actions with the rapier, even though it's more sort of point orientated. We did try a few parries, trying to actually see if we could lock with the dagger against the rapier in a cutting action. And what we found is that no, it becomes very, very unlikely that you're going to be able to actually get the blade in. What tends to happen is it bounces on one of the barbed sections or something like that, and actually is more likely to do damage to the dagger than it is to trap the rapier blade. So we found that no, against cutting actions it wasn't so effective. The next thing to consider is, when you're using a weapon like this, is do you use it in the way that rapier and dagger technique is usually intended to be used, and that is in single time. And what that means is, rather than try parry riposte at separate times with different weapons, we actually engage both at the same time. So somebody's coming in with an attack, the dagger goes out and our rapier goes forward all at the same time. And that's the kind of contra-tempo, counter-time stuff, which is really characteristic of the Italian rapier style. Now, would you do that with this dagger, or would you fish for the rapier, if you like? So withdraw your rapier, get the dagger out there, and specifically just aim to lock it, knowing that once it's locked, you've got plenty of time to choose your attack, so you can just focus them down separately. Now, could you do that? Of course you can. However, you become a little bit predictable. When you're using rapier, of course, you can use all single rapier technique is applicable to rapier and dagger, as well as then your rapier and dagger stuff as well. And if you're only using the dagger, you are not only reducing your technique down, you're also limiting some of your defensive options, because during certain attacks with rapier and dagger, it becomes necessary to use the rapier. During, for example, some attacks to the legs, some heavy cuts, they can't easily be parried with a little dagger. So by getting the dagger out there and using it solo initially to fish for the rapier, you can put yourself at a bit of disadvantage, and also you're giving away your tactics to your opponent big time. So that could be a problem. And the other issue we found is that such a small dagger doing that can be deceived quite easily. So when we were doing the sort of sparring drills, I found that if I did go fishing a little bit too much with the dagger, I could be struck a little bit more easily from some fast thrusting actions. So that didn't work particularly well. So going out there with the exact intention of using this from the start to trap and then do something with your sword became a little bit dangerous. And of course, the thing to remember with this dagger is that if you are not going out with the exact intention of trying to trap a blade, then it's just a normal rapier dagger. It's typical in its size, in roughly its weight, its dimensions, its level of protection. In every way, it is just a normal mangosh, a companion dagger to a rapier or similar weapon. So you could just draw this, use it in a fight, and treat it as a normal dagger. Nothing wrong with that. And you could then hope to achieve a lock or a trap in the middle of the fight as a slight bonus, as well as having the intimidation factor. And I think that's is potentially what this is really intended for. Is it's not going in there into the fight to intentionally trap. It's a possibility that could happen, and a nice bonus if it does. On to some variations of these kinds of daggers. There are lots of methods actually for creating traps on daggers. You'll see, for example, trident daggers as they're called. So they have a blade up here and a blade up here, and they usually hinge together and lock into the main blade so they can fit into a scabbard. And that's a really effective method for trapping blades. That's something I'm going to go into on another video. You'll also see sometimes bars coming up here, the trap blades coming down as they slide down the edges. You see that in some Spanish daggers. So there are a few different methods for trapping, but specifically on this Swordbreaker design, one of the things that I have seen on a few examples, only a few, is on the barbed sections here, they actually have a pin going through and effectively a hinged gate on each of the pins, which I'm going to show in an original example. And the idea being is that as a blade drops onto the gate will drop. As the blade hits the bottom, the gate will latch back up and lock. And that means that you've got a very, very effective trap of an opponent's blade. And the only way you're going to be able to draw that out is by pulling it all the way through, so you get the point back out, or by depressing one of those gates to get the blade back out. So that's another really interesting development of the Swordbreaker design. In terms of the weaknesses or potential disadvantages of using a Swordbreaker, well, as I've said, in terms of overall usefulness as a mangouche, it is a typical dagger. There is one real weakness that I would say, and that is this point here, is that this is inevitably going to be a stress point on the weapon itself. Is that if you've got any kind of thin piece of metal towards the base of the actual dagger, that's going to be a stress point. And we did actually bend this dagger by there quite badly on the sparring we did, particularly when we started cutting against it. So that is a weakness on most of these designs. Some of them are a bit thicker than that, but a lot aren't. So potentially that's a weakness. Though I would say I sparred with this for about 10 minutes and it held intact. Now, how long do you actually want or need a dagger like this to survive in a real fight? Because this isn't the kind of thing you're going to use for your training, where you're sparring with it day after day, week after week. No, this is something you're carrying as a sharp to actually use for real. And how often are you going to be in 10-minute engagements with this? Well, you're not realistically. So yes, it's a potential weakness, but I think unless you're going to be dealing with some very heavy blades or using it excessively often for some reason, that's not too much of a concern. So if you want to try this yourself in your own training, just a little bit of advice. Well, first of all, I bought a very, very cheap Swordbreaker. This is a John Barnett, which for all of his other products I would generally say avoid. You can use a few component parts for some interesting builds, but as a rule, ignore and avoid his products. I bought this one because it was really, really cheap. I knew it's not the kind of thing I was going to use very often because it's rather specialist and it does pose some safety risks to opponents and to blades. So the things to consider is, one, this blade will bend and not take and take the set and not return true, and that's not really surprising from John Barnett. There is an increased risk of breaking blades if you're using a Swordbreaker, and there's actually an even more increased risk of breaking blades when you use blunted. In fact, this has got a old rubber tip that's gone through. The rubber tips, inevitably, and bullet casings as well, will trap on the dagger, which is both unrealistic and potentially quite risky to blade breakage. So if you're going to use these in your sparring, the first thing to consider is it is going to put some increased wear on. Be very wary of that. There is therefore an increased risk of blade breakage. If blades, like rapier blades, break, they can go sharp, so you need to have both a level of concern for that happening and the protective gear to do so. So as a rule, I wouldn't put this into normal practice in sparring, but it is an interesting experiment if you wanted to get hold of one and try it. So I suppose the big question that you want to ask when it comes to the Swordbreaker is actually how effective is it in the fight? Now, we did something like 10 minutes roughly of sparring with it, and how many engagements were we able to get? Well, we obviously deliberately aimed for it because we wanted to try and experiment with the dagger. As a result, we also took a few hits that we shouldn't have done in a normal sparring scenario, so we were specifically trying to make it work. And even then, what we found was it is actually still relatively difficult. A lot of the time the blades, they brush off, they bounce off, they don't quite get the angle to sit into the teeth. So even when you're intentionally trying to get that engagement, it's still only a small possibility, and that is why I say I think it's a nice extra bonus, because most of the time you're not going to get some kind of engagement or lock with these teeth. So yeah, I think it's a normal dagger, and occasionally in certain actions, and you can encourage that situation to happen, you might be able to get a lock or a bind, but for the most of the time it is just a regular dagger. So in conclusion, what did we find out about this dagger and how did we find it in the fight? Well, I would say this kind of dagger really does exist as a marketing strategy, an intimidating weapon, and with a small chance of scoring a catch or bind in the actual fight. So I think it's a little small advantage which would be a useful sort of marketing strategy which could be effective at certain times. I think if you go into the fight and treat it so differently to you normally would a rapier and dagger fight, you can actually become unstuck using this. So I think what this is a normal main gauche to go with a rapier that has an interesting feature which occasionally might come into effect. So I think it's really quite interesting. It does have some effectiveness, but it's not as fight altering most of the time as you might sort of think. So yeah, interesting weapon. I think it looks cool. It does have some usefulness in the fight, and would I actually use one myself if I was actually sort of wearing one or wanted to use one in a real fight? Probably not. It's interesting. It's a curiosity item. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe if you haven't already.